June 14th, 1940. The City of Light did not fall with a roar of cannons or a final desperate stand at the barricades. It fell with the rhythmic, bone-chilling thud of jackboots on the pavement of the Champs-Élysées. For the people of Paris, it was the end of a world. The cafes that had hummed with gossip and philosophy only days before were now shuttered and silent. The boulevards were empty, save for the gray, green uniformants of the occupying force. But as the description ways of this first made that the Paris that he can displaying the Nazi flag was hoisted over the Eiffel Tower, the high command of the Third Reich was looking far beyond the monuments of the capital. They were looking at the maps of the countryside, and they were looking specifically at the cellars. To the Nazi leadership, France was not just a conquered territory to be policed. It was a vast, glittering warehouse of unparalleled wealth. They wanted the gold in the banks. They wanted the masterpieces in the Louvre. But above all else, they wanted the wine. In the twisted ideology of the Third Reich, the finest things in Europe belonged by right to the master race. Adolf Hitler, though he rarely drank himself, understood that wine was the ultimate symbol of prestige and a vital tool for international currency. His inner circle, however, had far more personal motivations. Men like Hermann Göring and Joseph Goebbels were obsessed with the trappings of aristocracy. They intended to stock their private estates and their underground bunkers with the greatest vintages of Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne. To manage this massive, state-sponsored theft, the Germans did not send simple looters or uneducated soldiers. They sent specialists. They appointed a group of men who came to be known as the Wein Führers. These were individuals who, before the war, had been wine merchants, importers, or distributors. They were men who spoke the language of the vineyards, who knew the difference between a common table wine and a 1921 Petrus. They knew exactly which cellars held the rarest bottles, and they knew exactly how much those bottles were worth on the black market. Among them was Otto Klebisch, a man whose name would soon become a curse whispered across the hills of the Champagne region. Klebisch arrived in the town of Reims with a singular, brutal mandate from Berlin. He was to seize 2 million bottles of the finest champagne every single week. It was a staggering demand, one that would have stripped the region bare in a matter of months. Klebisch was an officer who understood that wine was not just a luxury, it was the soul of France. By stealing the wine, he was not just providing for the victory parties in Berlin, he was attempting to break the French spirit by systematically removing the symbols of their national pride. But the men and women who tended the ancient vines of France were not prepared to let their heritage be consumed without a fight. They realized very early on that while they could not stop the German tanks with their bare hands, they could turn the very treasures the Nazis coveted into a weapon of resistance. They began what history would come to call the invisible sabotage. This was not a war of spectacular explosions or daring midnight raids on ammunition dumps. It was a war of subtle gestures, hidden rooms, psychological terror, and the patient use of time. It was a war fought in the damp, dark silence of the limestone caves, where the only sound was the slow drip of water from the ceiling. The first, and perhaps most brilliant move in this campaign, was the poison wine operation. As 1940 turned into 1941, and the weight of the occupation began to feel permanent, German soldiers began to notice something unsettling in the requisition cellars. Among the thousands of crates destined for the trains to Germany, certain bottles began to appear with a chilling new addition. In bold, jagged letters, a word was stamped across the glass or hand-painted onto the crates: poison. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The French vintners knew that the German soldiers were already nervous. They were in an occupied land, where every local face held a look of cold, silent hatred. Rumors began to circulate through the barracks that the French resistance had found a way to inject arsenic or cyanide into the wine shipments using long, thin needles through the corks. When a soldier reached for a bottle of champagne in a dark cellar, and his flashlight caught that label, he froze. Was it a bluff? Was it a genuine warning from a sympathetic worker? The vintners never clarified. They simply let the rumor grow. In many cases, the wine was perfectly safe, but the doubt was more effective than any actual toxin. Thousands of bottles of irreplaceable vintages were left behind, bypassed by soldiers who were willing to face enemy machine guns on the front lines, but were terrified of a slow, agonizing death from a glass of wine. This simple act of psychological labeling saved a significant portion of France's liquid history from being shipped away to the private cellars of Nazi officials. But the sabotage was not limited to mere labels. In the village of Santenay, deep in the heart of Burgundy, the resistance took a more direct approach. A group of German soldiers, searching for loot, discovered what they believed to be a hidden treasure in a local warehouse. They found crates of clear, strong spirits that they mistook for rare, high-quality gin. They were tired, they were cold, and they were looking for any way to forget the reality of the war. They seized the bottles and carried them back to their barracks for a night of celebration. What they did not know was that the local winemakers had anticipated their greed. The bottles did not contain gin. They were filled with a powerful, industrial-grade laxative that was used in the cleaning of vats. The result was a tactical disaster for the occupying force. Within a few hours, an entire German unit was completely incapacitated. They were unable to man their guard posts, unable to conduct patrols, and unable to respond to any movements in the area. While the soldiers were suffering, the local resistance used that window of opportunity to move vital intelligence and a shipment of stolen weapons across the region. It was a victory won with a knowledge of chemistry rather than a knowledge of ballistics. For the great wine families of France, the protection of their most valuable assets required even more elaborate deceptions. Maurice Drouhin, the patriarch of the legendary Drouhin winery in the town of Beaune, realized that the Wein Führers were becoming more aggressive. They were no longer satisfied with the wine that was presented to them. They were beginning to count the racks and inspect the floor plans. Drouhin knew that if he was going to save the best of his family's legacy, he would have to hide it in plain sight. Under the cover of night, while the German patrols were sticking to the main streets, Drouhin and a handful of his most trusted workers began a secret project in the deepest levels of their cellars. They worked in near total darkness, moving heavy stones and bags of mortar by hand. They built false walls to partition off the sections of the caves that held the rarest bottles, vintages that dated back to the 19th century. These were not flimsy wooden barriers. They were thick, stone structures designed to blend perfectly with the ancient foundations of the winery. To make the deception truly perfect, Drouhin added a detail that only a man who had spent his life in the cellars would think of. He sent his workers to the furthest, dampest corners of the property to collect hundreds of spiders. They brought the spiders into the cellar in jars and released them near the newly built walls. Within just a few weeks, the spiders had done exactly what Drouhin expected. They had covered the fresh mortar and the new stones with a thick, dusty layer of webs. When the German inspectors arrived with their flashlights and their clipboards, they saw walls that appeared to have been undisturbed for centuries. Behind those walls, Drouhin hid over 100,000 bottles of wine, including the priceless Romanée Conti. But the cellars held more than just wine. Because the Germans were so hesitant to spend time in the deeper, darker levels of the caves, Drouhin used the hidden sections to shelter Allied paratroopers who had been shot down and Jewish families who were fleeing the Gestapo. The wine provided the cover, and the spiders provided the camouflage. It was a sanctuary built on the foundations of French viticulture. The invisible Sabotage also provided the Allied High Command with some of the most accurate and unexpected intelligence of the entire war. In early 1941, a massive and highly specific order arrived at a champagne house from the German logistics department. The Nazis demanded tens of thousands of bottles of champagne, but there was a strange and non-negotiable requirement. The wine had to be packaged in special, reinforced crates, and every bottle had to be sealed with a specific type of cork that was designed to withstand extreme, sustained heat and low humidity. The winemakers, who lived by the rhythm of the climate, immediately understood the implication. They passed the details of the order to a resistance network that had a direct line to London. When the intelligence analysts at Bletchley Park and the War Office saw the report, the mystery of the German army's next move was solved. The Nazis were not preparing for a celebration in a temperate climate like Paris or Berlin. They were preparing for a major campaign in the deserts of North Africa. The wine order was the first concrete proof the Allies had of the imminent arrival of Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps. The thirst of the Nazi officers had betrayed their strategic secrets. As the war dragged on and the German occupation became more desperate and more violent, the sabotage in the vineyards became a daily occurrence. The vintners mastered the art of the switch. They would carefully steam the labels off of rare, 30-year-old vintages and glue them onto bottles of thin, sour wine that was barely fit for vinegar. They would then take the real, valuable wine and hide it in the most unlikely places, at the bottom of old wells, deep inside haystacks in the middle of fields, or buried in the earth between the rows of vines. The German officers, many of whom were more interested in the status of the label than the quality of the drink, would sit in their requisitioned villas and toast to their victory with what they thought was the finest Bordeaux in the world. In reality, they were drinking fermented grape juice that was a mockery of the label on the bottle. Every time a Nazi official complained about the disappointing quality of a great French vintage, the winemakers would simply shrug and blame the weather or the transport. It was a silent, liquid rebellion that tasted of ash in the mouths of the occupiers. The risks of this behavior were terrifying. The Wein Führers were not easily fooled, and if a vintner was caught intentionally sabotaging a shipment destined for a high-ranking official, the punishment was not a fine. It was the Gestapo. It meant the firing squad or the cattle cars to the east. Yet, the sabotage never stopped. In the Bordeaux region, workers would intentionally misdirect shipments, sending crates of premium wine to small, remote villages where they would be lost in transit, while sending crates of low-quality table wine to the Nazi headquarters at the Hotel Majestic in Paris. By the summer of 1944, the atmosphere in France had changed. The Allies had landed on the beaches of Normandy, and the sound of distant thunder was no longer the weather. It was the Allied artillery. The German army was beginning its long, chaotic retreat. But as the Nazis prepared to leave the wine regions, they decided that if they could not have the treasures of France, no one would. In the town of Epernay, the very heart of the champagne industry, the retreating German units placed massive amounts of explosives in the great chalk cellars. Their plan was simple and cruel. They would blow up the caves, destroying millions of bottles and the centuries of history they represented, leaving behind nothing but rubble and broken glass. The explosives were wired, and the detonators were ready. The German commander in the area had orders to trigger the blasts the moment the first American tanks appeared on the outskirts of the town. But the Germans had not accounted for the sheer, relentless speed of General George Patton and the Third Army. The Americans were moving with such aggression, bypassing traditional German defensive lines and striking from unexpected directions, that the units in Epernay were seized by panic. On August 28, 1944, the American tanks roared into the streets of Epernay. The German soldiers were forced to flee for their lives so quickly that they did not have the time to reach the detonators. The cellars and the millions of bottles inside them remained intact. When the American soldiers finally descended into the cool, dark vaults, they did not find a graveyard of glass. They found rows upon rows of champagne, resting silently on their racks, saved by a margin of only a few minutes. The liberation of the wine regions was not just a military milestone, it was the restoration of the French soul. The wine had survived the most systematic attempt at cultural theft in history. The invisible sabotage had been a success. Throughout the 4 years of darkness, the vintners had played a high-stakes game of chess with a brutal regime, and through a combination of wit, bravery, and a refusal to be broken, they had won. After the war, the false walls in the cellars of Beaune and Reims were torn down. The bottles were carefully retrieved from the wells, the haystacks, and the forest floors. The poison labels were scrubbed away, and the real vintages were restored to their rightful places. But the stories of those years did not disappear. They became part of the terroir, the history of the land itself. Sometimes, the most important battles are not fought on a field with thousands of men. They are fought by a single person in a dark room who refuses to give up. The winemakers of France proved that even a simple glass bottle can be a fortress of resistance. They protected their nation's history with nothing but their ingenuity and their love for the soil they stood on. They showed the world that you can occupy the land, and you can take the buildings, but you can never truly own a people who know how to wait, how to hide, and how to fight for the things that make them who they are.